Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to picture, right now, the most lethal, highly trained operative you can possibly imagine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right, like someone who has spent decades mastering their physical reality, a tactician who operates at just the absolute peak of human endurance. And now, picture that exact same person completely collapsed.
Physically collapsing.
No, that's the thing. Not from a physical wound, not from an opposing army, but because they simply cannot stop the endless, terrifying loop of their own thoughts. They just throw their weapons down, look at their mentor, and admit utter humiliating defeat at the hands of their own mind.
It's a really striking image
Yeah.
because, it completely shatters that illusion we all have that mental mastery is somehow just a byproduct of physical discipline or external success. Like, you can conquer the entire physical world and still be a complete hostage in your own head.
Exactly. And that is exactly where we are starting today. Because that ancient warlord collapsing on a blood-soaked battlefield is experiencing the exact same biological glitch that you, the listener, feel when, say, a Slack notification goes off at 9 p.m.
Yeah, that sudden drop in your stomach.
Right. Today, we are looking directly at you and the very specific, very modern mental crisis you are likely navigating right this second, the burnout, the information overload, that low-grade constant hum of anxiety, and most importantly, that deeply unsettling feeling that your own mind is running the show instead of you.
And what's fascinating here is the profound irony of it all. I mean, we are dealing with this incredibly modern 21st century smartphone-induced crisis.
Oh, yeah.
The feeling of being just completely overwhelmed by your inbox, or the sensation that your attention span has been fractured into a million little pieces. Yet to understand the actual mechanics of this, our mission today is to dive into a set of notes that bridge cutting-edge modern neurobiology with a 5,000-year-old spiritual text. Specifically, the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6, verses 34 and 35.
Which, it sounds totally absurd on its face. What could a guy standing on a wooden chariot with a bow and arrow possibly know about, infinite scrolling algorithms or the absolute dread of opening an email from your boss?
Right, because the context of the Gita is this massive epic civil war.
Yeah.
But the text pivots. The core struggle we are dissecting today isn't about the arrows flying outside. It's about the architecture of the human mind inside.
Yeah.
The fact that an ancient text zeroes in on the exact same psychological paralysis you face today, sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic or staring at a glowing rectangle, well, it tells us that the hardware we are dealing with hasn't changed at all. The human condition is just remarkably consistent.
So, before we can even attempt to give you the tools to fix a restless mind, we really have to look at the baseline. We have to establish just how historically fundamentally difficult this hardware is to operate.
It's not a new problem.
No, not at all. You are not uniquely broken because you can't stop doom scrolling. And to prove it, let's look at this main character we mentioned, Arjuna.
Yeah, Arjuna anchors this entire premise. He is, by all accounts, the absolute pinnacle of focus. As a master warrior, he has spent his entire life training his nervous system to respond flawlessly under extreme pressure.
We're talking about a guy with elite executive function.
Exactly, elite. And yet, when he is faced with this existential mental crisis, he turns to Krishna, who is his charioteer and his guide, and he essentially says he is entirely powerless.
The specific Sanskrit phrase he uses to describe this defeat is just fascinating. It's Vayor Eva Sudupkaram. He tells Krishna, trying to control the mind feels like trying to catch the wind in my hands.
Think about the physics of that metaphor for a second.
It's impossible.
Right, because the wind is pervasive. It's formless. It is entirely indifferent to physical strength. The harder you squeeze your hands together to trap it, the faster the air just escapes through your fingers.
Wow.
And Arjuna is an individual whose entire identity is constructed around his ability to physically grasp and manipulate his environment. So for him to admit that his strength means absolutely nothing against this invisible internal force, it's a profound realization of our biological limits.
It really makes me think about the environment he was operating in versus ours. Like, Arjuna was having this complete existential breakdown 5,000 years ago. He was existing in what we would consider today to be a profoundly slow, distraction-free environment.
Oh, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
It was an environment dictated by natural rhythms. The sun sets, the world goes dark, stimulation drops to near zero.
Right.
He did not have a supercomputer in his pocket vibrating with breaking news alerts that were explicitly engineered to exploit his dopamine receptors.
He wasn't dealing with a 24/7 news cycle telling him the economy was collapsing while simultaneously getting a ping from his boss demanding a spreadsheet by morning.
Exactly. Even in that relative silence, even without our modern technology actively weaponizing his attention, he found his own mind to be as uncontrollable as a hurricane.
Which, I mean, brings up a really uncomfortable question. It's like fighting a boss in a video game, you know? You can learn the physical attacks of a real enemy, but the mind is like a glitch in the game's code itself.
That's a great way to put it.
So if catching the wind was considered biologically impossible 5,000 years ago for a master warrior in a distraction-free world, I mean, are we just structurally doomed today? From an evolutionary standpoint, is the human brain just fundamentally unsuited to survive the 21st century?
Well, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, the mismatch is severe. It really is. The brain you are using right now to navigate a barrage of emails and social media notifications is the exact same hardware Arjuna possessed.
No upgrades.
Zero upgrades. That brain evolved over millions of years to do one primary thing, and that is to keep you alive in a dangerous, unpredictable environment. It evolved to constantly scan the horizon for predators, to be highly attuned to sudden changes, and, crucially, to prioritize negative information.
Because ignoring a tiger kills you, but ignoring a beautiful sunset does not.
Precisely. So our hardware is literally structurally biased toward threat detection. Now, take that highly reactive threat-seeking hardware and drop it into an environment engineered by behavioral scientists to trigger those exact survival instincts constantly.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It is. Algorithms don't just show you information. They deliver highly calibrated, variable ratio rewards and threat signals to keep your nervous system engaged. You are taking a system designed for occasional acute bursts of physical survival stress and putting it into a state of chronic, low-grade psychological stimulation.
It's like taking a Formula One car, right? Something designed to go 200 miles an hour for a couple of hours, and then you just stick it in bumper-to-bumper city traffic for a decade. The engine is just going to tear itself apart.
That is exactly what happens. The exhaustion you feel at the end of a workday isn't necessarily from caloric expenditure. It is the exhaustion of an evolutionary mismatch.
So Arjuna is standing in this ancient version of the same mismatch, feeling completely overwhelmed. But he doesn't just complain. He actually gives Krishna a highly specific 4-part clinical diagnosis of exactly what his mind is doing.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, because this is where we transition from the ancient battlefield directly into your modern neurobiology. Arjuna uses 4 specific adjectives in verse 34 to describe the anatomy of his restlessness. And we are going to dig into the mechanics of this cascade.
Because what is truly remarkable here is how flawlessly these ancient Sanskrit terms map directly onto modern 21st century neuroscientific discoveries. Arjuna essentially outlines a cascading failure of the human nervous system.
Let's start with the first adjective he uses, kanyakalam, which translates to restless or fickle. How does ancient restlessness translate to modern brain imaging?
In modern neuroscience, Kanya-Kalam is the behavioral manifestation of what we call the default mode network, or the DMN.
Okay, the DMN.
Right. And the DMN was discovered somewhat accidentally, actually, back in 2001 by a neurologist named Marcus Rachel.
How so?
Well, researchers were putting people in fMRI machines and asking them to perform specific cognitive tasks, right?
Right.
Like math problems or reading. And then they were looking at which brain areas lit up. But Rachel noticed something bizarre happening in the control state. The moments when subjects were told to just close their eyes and do absolutely nothing.
You would assume the brain just kind of powers down, right? Like a computer going to sleep or a screensaver.
That was the assumption for a long time. But Rachel saw that when subjects stopped doing a specific task, this vast interconnected network of brain regions suddenly flared into massive activity. The brain was consuming almost 20% of the body's energy, while ostensibly doing nothing at all.
20%. Just to do nothing.
Exactly. This is the default mode network. When you aren't focused on the outside world, your brain defaults to this internally directed network.
What exactly is it doing with all that energy? I mean, 20% is huge.
It is time traveling. The DMN is responsible for autobiographical memory, theory of mind, and envisioning the future. In Buddhist philosophy, this has long been called the monkey mind. It basically yanks you backward into the past, rehashing some awkward conversation you had 3 years ago, or dwelling on a perceived failure.
Oh, I hate when it does that.
Right. And then it slingshots you into the future, simulating catastrophic scenarios about a meeting next week that hasn't even happened yet.
So when you're, sitting at your desk trying to write a report, and suddenly you are agonizing over a typo you made in an email yesterday, that isn't a character flaw. That is your can you call a mind, your default mode network just running its evolutionary programming.
Precisely. The DMN simulates past and future scenarios to prepare you for potential threats. It refuses to stay in the present moment because, evolutionarily speaking, the present moment is rarely where the hypothetical danger lies. So it is a biological feature, not a bug, even if it completely fragments your focus in the modern office.
But this time-traveling default state isn't just a harmless background process, right? It physically cascades. Which brings us to Arjuna's second adjective, pramati, translating to turbulent or agitating. How does a rogue thought about an email turn into actual physical agitation?
Pramathi represents the physiological escalation of that thought. This is where the mind pulls the physical body into the crisis. The DMN doesn't just show you a bad memory or a scary future. It actually communicates with your endocrine system.
Okay.
See, when you simulate a stressful scenario, your brain often cannot distinguish between a real, immediate physical threat and an imagined psychological one.
Wait, really? So if I'm worrying about, like, my mortgage, my brain treats it the exact same way as a physical predator standing in the room.
To a very significant degree, yes. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, which then signals the adrenal glands. This is known as the HPA axis. And you get this massive dump of cortisol and adrenaline flooding directly into your bloodstream.
Wow.
Think of the mechanics of reading a highly provocative, anger-inducing headline on your phone. You aren't in any physical danger sitting on your couch, but your endocrine system perceives a threat to your worldview or your social group.
And your heart rate spikes, your breathing gets shallow, your stomach just drops.
That is pramathi. Your ancient biology is preparing you to physically fight or sprint for your life. It's shunting blood away from your digestive organs and pushing it into your extremities.
But you're just sitting there.
Exactly. Your modern reality requires you to just sit motionless and stare at a screen. So you have generated this high-octane chemical energy with absolutely nowhere physical to go. That trapped chemical energy agitates your entire nervous system. It is literal internal turbulence.
And if you are constantly triggering that throughout the day, with news alerts and emails and texts, you are essentially living in a state of chronic turbulence.
A constant simmer of stress.
Which sets up the third word Arjuna uses perfectly. Balavat. Powerful. Now, the source notes map this onto amygdala hijacking. But I want to get past the basic definition here. Why is the emotional brain so uniquely powerful that it can completely override logic?
We're talking about raw signaling speed and biological hierarchy here. The amygdala is essentially your brain's fire alarm system. It is constantly assessing the environment for emotional salience, primarily fear. Now, on the other hand, the prefrontal cortex, the area right behind your forehead, is the logical, rational, adult part of the brain. It handles impulse control and long-term planning.
Right, the part that knows you need a good night's sleep and that doom scrolling at 1 a.m. is a terrible idea.
Exactly. But here is the structural reality. When sensory data enters the brain, it hits a relay station called the thalamus. And the thalamus routes the signal in two directions simultaneously. It sends a signal down the low road directly to the amygdala, which takes roughly 12 milliseconds.
12 milliseconds.
Right. But it also sends a signal down the high road to the prefrontal cortex. And that path takes about 30 to 40 milliseconds.
Wait, so the emotional alarm system receives the data literally twice as fast as the logical brain?
Yes. And in an evolutionary context, this makes perfect sense.
Okay.
If you see a coiled shape in the grass, you need to jump backward immediately. And that's driven by the fast amygdala pathway before your slower prefrontal cortex takes the time to logically deduce whether it's a venomous snake or just a curved stick.
That makes sense.
You are biologically experiencing fear and physically reacting to it before you're even fully conscious of what you're looking at.
This explains so much about modern behavioral failure. When you feel the impulse to seek out one more hit of dopamine on a social feed, or you get the urge to fire off an angry reply to a tweet, your prefrontal cortex is just fundamentally outpaced. The amygdala hijacks the system, physically inhibiting the prefrontal cortex before logic even enters the chat.
That is the Balavat nature of the mind. The emotional brain exerts a power that subjugates the rational mind through sheer speed and chemical suppression. It is powerful.
Which leads to the fourth and final clinical diagnosis from the ancient battlefield, denim. Stubborn or obstinate. If the system is already restless, turbulent, and hijacked by speed, how does it also become stubborn?
Well, Bidham speaks to the neurological reality of habit formation and neuroplasticity. The brain is an incredibly efficient organ, It consumes a lot of energy, as we talked about, so it constantly seeks ways to automate behaviors to save calories.
Like putting things on autopilot.
Exactly. When you repeat an action, say, reaching for your phone, the millisecond you feel a hint of boredom, your brain fires a specific sequence of neurons.
And the brain structurally reinforces that exact sequence.
Yes, through a process called myelination, the brain coats these frequently used neural pathways in a fatty substance called myelin. Think of it like the insulation on a copper wire.
Okay, I can picture that.
It prevents signal leakage and makes the electrical impulse travel significantly faster and more efficiently. So, the more you repeat a behavior, the thicker the myelin gets and the faster and more automatic the behavior becomes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to ground this in the real world of our listeners. Tech algorithms don't just passively exist, right? They are designed around variable ratio reward schedules, which is the exact same mechanics as a slot machine.
Precisely.
Sometimes you pull to refresh and get absolutely nothing, but sometimes you get a highly novel piece of information or some form of social validation.
And that unpredictability creates a massive dopamine reward prediction error in the brain, which is the absolute strongest driver of learning and habituation. The algorithm is essentially a highly optimized tool for thickening the myelin on your distraction pathways.
It's hacking the system.
It takes your natural vulnerability, the desire for novelty and social connection, and aggressively entrenches it. The neural pathway becomes remarkably stubborn, aggressively resisting change.
So I have to ask a blunt question here. If our neural pathways are stubborn, thickly insulated like deep ruts in a muddy dirt road, doesn't that mean we are biologically rigged to fail against these modern infinite scroll algorithms? I mean, they are billion-dollar algorithms designed specifically to deepen those exact ruts. Are we just structurally doomed?
If you leave the mind completely unchecked, if you simply let the default systems run their automated programming, then yes, you are rigged to lose. The deep ruts in that dirt road will guide the tires of your attention straight into the ditch every single time because the biological gravity pulling you there is immense.
Well, that is an absolutely terrifying place to leave the listener. A brain that time travels, floods the body with stress hormones, bypasses logic at twice the speed of thought, and structurally insulates its own bad habits. Great.
It sounds bleak.
It really does, but Arjuna delivers this devastating reality check to Krishna, and the response from the spiritual teacher completely subverts expectations. I mean, you would think the first step to fighting back would be severe discipline, like toughen up, focus harder, stop making excuses.
Right, the modern hustle culture approach.
Exactly, but it's not discipline. The actual first step is validation.
This is perhaps the most profound psychological insight in the entire text, precisely because it runs so counter to our modern instincts. We move to verse 35. Krishna listens to this massive outpouring of frustration, and his response is entirely devoid of judgment. He doesn't lecture Arjuna, he doesn't offer toxic positivity, or tell him to just calm down.
Which, biologically speaking, telling someone to calm down during an amygdala hijack is essentially pouring gasoline on a fire.
Oh, absolutely. It invalidates the very real physiological turbulence they are experiencing. Instead, Krishna begins his response with 3 words. Asajam Mahabaho. This translates to, undoubtedly, O mighty armed one, the mind is indeed difficult to curb.
Undoubtedly, he just flat out agrees that the hardware is exceptionally difficult to operate.
He validates the struggle completely. He confirms that dealing with your own mind is objectively, inherently, universally difficult. And what those sources point out is how this 5,000-year-old moment of validation directly mirrors the foundation of modern clinical psychology. Specifically, acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
Okay, I hear what you're saying about validation, but let's ground this again. If a listener just sits there and validates their inability to focus while they have a quarterly report due in 3 hours, they are going to get fired. So what does this all mean for the listener? Is this self-compassion just giving ourselves a free pass to stay distracted? Or is it a tactical move to disarm the anxiety of failing? How is this not just dressing up procrastination in therapy speak?
Because validation is not acquiescence. It is not giving up. It is a required neurochemical reset. Yes. To understand why, you have to look at the biology of self-judgment. If we connect this to the bigger picture, let's say your mind wanders while writing that report. You catch yourself checking social media. What is your immediate internal monologue?
Oh, usually a brittle spiral. Like, what is wrong with you? Why can't you just focus? You're going to miss the deadline. You have no discipline.
Exactly. You experience the primary event, which is distraction. And that is just the default mode network doing its normal job. But then you layer a secondary event on top of it. Shame, frustration, and intense self-judgment.
Right.
When you attack yourself internally, your amygdala interprets that self-hatred as a threat. You trigger a Pramati stress response, pumping cortisol into your system, not because of an external danger, but because you are angry at yourself for being distracted.
And what does cortisol do to the brain in that moment?
High levels of cortisol bind to receptors in the prefrontal cortex, the very part of your brain responsible for executive function, concentration, and completing that quarterly report. Cortisol literally disconnects and inhibits your prefrontal cortex.
Wait, really?
Yes, you physically cannot build better focus or do deep cognitive work while your brain is bathed in stress hormones caused by self-loathing.
Wow. That completely flips the paradigm. You are burning massive amounts of cognitive energy beating yourself up, which physiologically prevents you from doing the work you're beating yourself up for not doing.
Precisely. What Krishna does with Asaya Mahabahal, undoubtedly, it is difficult, and what modern ACT therapy does is cut off that secondary layer of suffering. Validation deactivates the brain's alarm system. By acknowledging that mental training is inherently challenging, you stop the cortisol dump. You clear the biological runway so that actual, deliberate cognitive work can take place.
So step one, validate. You recognize the mind is restless, turbulent, powerful, and stubborn. You acknowledge the biological difficulty. You stop beating yourself up, and the alarm bells quiet down. Now you actually have access to your prefrontal cortex. But you still need the tools to rewire the machine. And the sources provide a timeless, twofold solution.
Right. Once the alarm is quieted, Krishna provides the blueprint in verse 35. He says, Avyasana tu kanteya vairagyakatayate. The mind is tamed by two things, avyasa and vairagya.
Let's break these down, starting with adhyasa. The translation is practice, but how does that translate into the mechanics of neuroplasticity we discussed earlier?
Avyasa is repetitive, deliberate, continuous practice. To understand how this works biologically, we need to look at another network in the brain, the salience network.
Okay, what is the salience network?
It's primarily anchored in the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, and it acts as the brain switchboard operator. It constantly monitors internal and external stimuli and decides what deserves your attention. It's what switches you between the default mode network, which is mind-wandering, and the central executive network, which is focused task engagement.
Okay, so let's put this in action. I sit down to work, prefrontal cortex is engaged. 5 minutes later, the DMN kicks in, and I start thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch.
Right. At some point, you realize, oh, I'm thinking about lunch. I'm supposed to be working. That moment of realization is your salience network coming online and noticing the deviation. Now you have a choice.
The crossroads.
Exactly. You can trigger the self-judgment cascade, which floods the brain with cortisol. Or you can apply abhyasa. You gently, without judgment, shift the switchboard back to the task.
And what is literally happening in the cellular structure of the brain when you make that gentle return?
Every single time you catch your mind wandering and pull it back, you are firing a specific set of neurons in your prefrontal cortex. You're actively laying down new myelin on the pathways of executive control. It is the mental equivalent of a bicep curl.
I love that, a bicep curl for the brain.
Exactly. You are physically sculpting your brain, making the prefrontal cortex denser and more efficient over time at overriding the impulses of the amygdala.
That's the active component, the reps. But there's a second pillar, vairagya. The translation here is dispassion or detachment. And this word carries a lot of baggage. When people hear detachment, they picture a monk in a cave who just doesn't care about anything. But how does this concept survive modern corporate capitalism, where detaching from a frantic boss might literally just get you fired?
It's a really critical distinction. The sources reframe vairagya not as running away from life, but as cognitive diffusion.
Cognitive diffusion.
Yes, it's a core concept in ACT therapy. It is the ability to separate yourself from your thoughts and impulses. Normally, we are fused with our thoughts. If you think, I am an anxious mess about this presentation, you believe it is a core truth. You merge with the anxiety.
You become the emotion.
Exactly. Vairagya is the practice of creating space between the observer and the observed. It's the ability to observe a thought, an emotion, or an external demand without immediately internalizing it. So in the workplace scenario, your boss emails you at 9 p.m. demanding an answer. You don't ignore the email. That would be apathy. And yes, it would get you fired.
Right.
But you practice internal vairagya. You notice the panic rising in your chest. Instead of fusing with it and saying, I am in danger, everything is ruined, you reframe it. You say, I am noticing that my body is having a physical stress response to an email. You perform the action required, replying to the boss, but you do not allow the external demand to kidnap your internal state.
I love this. Varega sounds like watching cars on a busy highway. You're standing on an overpass, you look down and you see the doom-scrolling car drive by or the 9 p.m. panic car zoom past. You acknowledge the traffic is there, it's real, but you realize you don't actually have to run down the embankment and jump into the passenger seat of every chaotic car that drives by. You can just watch them pass.
That analogy perfectly captures cognitive diffusion. You are aware of the traffic, but you remain on the overpass.
But are these two pillars codependent? What happens if someone tries to practice one without the other? Let's say someone is incredibly disciplined about apiyasa. They meditate, they try to force their focus on work, but they have absolutely zero vairagya. They are totally attached to every outcome and every notification.
This raises an important question, because if you practice focus without detachment, you will inevitably hit a wall of exhaustion. You are trying to build the prefrontal cortex, but you are still emotionally hooked by every single urge and stressor. It's like trying to bail water out of a sinking boat without plugging the hole first.
Right.
You might develop incredibly strong arms from bailing the water, that's your akiyasa, but you're still going to sink because you haven't detached from the source of the flood.
And if we flip it, what if someone practices extreme detachment, vairagya, but they never do the deliberate practice of apiyasa?
Then you slide into the exact apathy you mentioned earlier. Detachment without a focused, deliberate direction leads to a lack of purpose. You might not be bothered by your phone anymore, but you aren't pointing your attention toward anything meaningful either. You have plugged the hole in the boat, but you aren't rowing anywhere. You are just drifting.
Theory is great, but how does the listener actually apply this ancient neuroscience before their next stressful meeting or the moment they wake up tomorrow? The sources give us a highly actionable, step-by-step application, starting with microabhyasa.
And the emphasis here must be on the word micro. When people realize they need to train their prefrontal cortex, they often set impossible, sweeping goals. They declare they are going to meditate for an hour a day, starting tomorrow.
Which guarantees failure, which then triggers the cortisol-dumping shame cycle we just talked about.
Exactly. Microabhyasa means starting remarkably small to bypass the brain's resistance to change. We are talking about 10 minutes of daily conscious breathing. You sit down, set a timer, and place your full attention on the physical sensation of air moving in and out of your nose.
And what happens when the DMN immediately takes over?
It absolutely will. Your mind is going to stray. It might wander 50 times in those 10 minutes. It will plan dinner, worry about a meeting, replay an argument. But here is the profound paradigm shift from the sources. Do not view the mind wandering as a failure. When the mind strays 50 times, you must celebrate the 50 times you noticed and brought it back.
Celebrate the distraction.
You celebrate the return, because every time you notice the distraction and bring your focus back to the breath, that is the abhyasa, that is the bicep curl for your prefrontal cortex. If you sit for 10 minutes and your mind never wanders once, you haven't actually done any reps. The wandering and the returning is the workout.
I want you to really hear that. The distraction isn't the enemy ruining your practice. The distraction is the resistance you need to build the muscle. Okay, so that handles the reps. What about practical, daily, intentional vairagya?
Intentional vairagya requires structural changes to your digital hygiene. You must create tech-free buffers in your daily routine, particularly in the first hour after you wake up and the hour before you go to sleep.
Why are those specific windows so critical neurologically?
Because of brainwave states. When you are waking up or falling asleep, your brain is transitioning between the slower delta or theta waves of sleep and the active beta waves of waking consciousness. During these transitions, often passing through alpha states, your brain is highly plastic and deeply impressionable.
Okay, so it's vulnerable.
Very. If the very first thing you do when you open your eyes is look at a screen, you are instantly flooding a vulnerable brain with pramati turbulence and handing control over to the balavat, the powerful emotional amygdala. You let an algorithm set the neurochemical baseline for your entire day.
If I'm trying to implement intentional vairagya tomorrow morning, what's the physical reality of writing out that dopamine wave when my phone is sitting right there on the nightstand? I turn the alarm off. The urge to just tap the email icon or check social media is intensely strong. Does it feel physically uncomfortable?
It can be highly uncomfortable. A dopamine craving operates like a wave pattern in your nervous system. When you look at the phone, the wave starts to rise because your brain is anticipating a reward. If you deny the urge, the wave peaks. And at that peak, it manifests as mild withdrawal. You might feel tightness in your chest, a twitch in your thumb, or a surge of anxiety.
You literally feel physically agitated.
Yes, but here is the secret of intentional vairagya. You let the wave rise. You feel the physical discomfort, and you let it fall without riding it. You apply cognitive diffusion. You stand on the overpass and observe. My chest is tight. I am experiencing a severe craving for dopamine. You do not fight the feeling, because fighting it gives it energy.
Right.
But you do not obey it either. You just wait. And within a few minutes, the neurochemical wave will naturally crash and recede.
And what happens to the neural pathway when you do that?
Every time you starve the habit loop of the reward it expects, you are weakening that danim, that stubborn, myelinated pathway. Over time, the cravings become weaker and less frequent.
So we have these two daily practices, microabhisa, the reps of returning the focus, and intentional vairagya, observing the urge without acting on it. The sources bring this all together using an incredible analogy from the underlying philosophy. They describe abhasa and vairagya as the two wings of an eagle.
It represents the perfect synthesis required for mastery. Think about the aerodynamics of flight. An eagle cannot fly with one wing.
Obvious.
If you only practice abhyasa, constantly forcing focus, you flap in a frantic circle, exhausted by your own effort, but still weighed down by your attachments. If you only practice vairagya detachment, you have the other wing. But without the effort of practice, you simply plummet in apathy.
But when you deploy both simultaneously,
When you have both, they create lift. They stabilize each other. The practice gives you upward momentum, and the detachment allows you to glide effortlessly above the turbulence. When these two wings operate in harmony, the mind undergoes a fundamental transformation. It shifts from being a turbulent, destructive master that dictates your nervous system into a peaceful, highly capable servant that you direct at will.
what a profound journey. From a chariot on an ancient battlefield to the fMRI scans of your default mode network. To quickly recap the ground we've covered for you, we established that struggling with a restless mind is a timeless biological condition. We mapped the ancient anatomy of restlessness onto your modern stress responses and habit loops.
Right.
We learned that the crucial first step isn't militant discipline, but profound validation, quieting the cortisol dump of shame so you can actually engage your prefrontal cortex. And finally, we explored the blueprint, building the twin pillars of deliberate practice and calm detachment to literally rewire your brain.
You now understand the actual mechanics of the machine. You know about the signaling speed of the amygdala, the energy consumption of the DMN, and the myelination of habits. Understanding the why and the how means you are no longer just a helpless passenger in your own head.
But before we let you go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We talked about microabhisa, how the very act of catching your mind wandering is the exact thing that builds the density of your prefrontal cortex. I want to offer you a massive reframe on the modern world.
A reframe on the chaos.
Yes. What if our endless modern distractions, the smartphones, the algorithms, the chaotic open plan offices, the 24/7 news cycle, what if they aren't just horrible obstacles ruining our peace? What if they are actually the heavyweights in the gym we need to lift?
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about it. Because we are surrounded by such an unprecedented volume of distraction, we have thousands of opportunities every single day to catch our mind wandering. Applying a PSA 50 times a day might just give you the opportunity to achieve a level of neurological mastery, a density in your prefrontal cortex, and a depth of focus that even the ancient warriors 5,000 years ago didn't have access to, simply because they didn't have as much weight to lift.
That is a deeply empowering way to view the landscape. It takes a very thing causing the burnout and turns it into the tool for mastery. The resistance becomes the path.
The resistance becomes the path. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Validate the struggle, practice the reps, stay on the overpass, and remember that every time you catch your mind wandering today, you just got a little bit stronger. We'll see you next time.